Welcome to Godsplaining, Contemplative Preachers, Contemporary Age. Each week, join the Dominican friars as they consider all things Catholic.
Hello, and welcome back to Godsplaining. I am Father Gregory Pine, joining you from Freiburg, Switzerland, here with Father Bertrand Janczyk in sunny Washington, D.C. Father Bertrand, how are things?
Fine. I don't know if things are sunny. The blinds are closed, so it was kind of sunny earlier, and it kind of got cloudy, and then it was really windy, super windy, 25 mile an hour winds with like 50 mile an hour gusts. So I can hear the wind, but that's it. Probably not. You probably weren't looking for a weather report, but you got it. So
I'm glad to receive a weather report. Sometimes on my little weather app, I have my hometown, I have Washington, D.C., and I have Freiburg, Switzerland. And when I go to check the weather in Freiburg, I'm like, oh, yeah, it's, negative 1,000. And then I look at Washington, D.C., and it's always like 78 degrees. And that causes me great anguish. Whoa, emptiness and pain. But that's okay, because I console myself with chocolate and cheese and timepieces. Because such is life in Switzerland. It's just bountiful in those three categories of things.
That's great.
None of which is human affection. Actually, a cool thing that I did recently in Switzerland was I went on this hike in this canton, which is like a state called Valais. And I hiked next to a glacier for a long time. What's that?
In Valais, where they park the cars. Oh my gosh, it was a joke.
Oh, man, that was savage. I didn't even see that coming. Yeah, okay. So it's spelled differently, but that's immaterial because this is not a written podcast. This is a spoken podcast. But I hiked next to a glacier for like a good 3 hours. So like a primordial ice flow, which, never mind. I'm going to stop talking about this because people are like, why are they talking about glaciers? And why is he talking about glaciers? I'm not going to implicate you in this, my misadventure.
I was talking about the wind, so I think we're even now in being terrible podcasters. So we're back at square one after 2+ years. We're still awful at this, but
thank you.
Thanks for being here.
So thank you to all those who have helped to get to this point. I'd call it a zenith, but it's more like a nadir. Dude, that was a 10th grade vocab. Never mind. Moving on, Father Gregory. Get to the episode. So for this episode, we're going to talk about temperaments, which is a difficult word to spell because there's like a stray A in the middle. Not as difficult to spell as victuals, which looks like victuals, but again, besides the point, spoken podcast. So we're going to talk about temperaments because it's a thing that people talk about. It's one of those conversation starters where people will talk about temperaments, or they'll talk about like 5 love languages, or they'll talk about your Myers-Briggs index. It's kind of like where do you fall personality-wise? And there's some helpful things that you can gain from it. I think sometimes there can be some unhelpful ways by which to apply it, but that's what we're here to talk about. That's what we're here to sort out. So I guess temperaments fall broadly within kind of psychology. This would be more like pop psychology than the type of psychology for which you would go to school for like 6 years. But maybe you could set us up, Father Bertrand, and situate the conversation. Is psychology important to know about, not important to know about? Does it help us? Does it hurt us? What do we think?
It's not important, and it only hurts us. So that's kind of where that sits. So we're good on that. No, I guess it's fine. Yeah. So I guess we'll talk about like as pop psychology, because this is, I guess, pop in as much as people kind of talk about it casually and, like in an unstudied way. Though some people study it. So, but we're talking about it in the unstudied kind of popular way of understanding temperaments, personality, dispositions, those kind of things. Is it helpful? I think in some ways. I think we can say in some ways it's helpful. I was recently, I don't know, as recently as like 6 months ago, was reading a book on the Enneagram, and it's like a Catholic interpretation of the Enneagram. And it was interesting to read, like, I don't even remember how many different numbers there are. This is how like closely I was reading. But with the different kind of personality dispositions through the Enneagram, there were ways where it's like, I can identify people as like a 2 3, 4, whatever, however it works. So like, I'm this number. I'm not going to tell you what I thought I was, because I don't reveal personal things about me. That's why we talk about the wind. But yeah, so I think there was something helpful in it. One of the points that I found to be helpful in this particular author, who is writing about the Enneagram, we're going to talk more about, I think, like the 4 temperaments than the Enneagram, but was his caveat throughout the book was that the Enneagram, or your number, where you fall on this scale or this like circle thing, shape thing, isn't so much a definer of your characteristics. It doesn't define who you are, but is a way by which to understand people, people's predisposition to react to certain circumstances or in certain settings. So I thought that's an insightful and helpful way to approach things that are sort of pop psychology, like the temperaments or the Enneagram or these kind of things. That it's not a way by which to box people in, but a way by which to understand, at least generally, people who are kind of in this category, whether they're choleric or melancholic or a 12 whatever on the Enneagram scale. It's like typically they're going to react to these kind of external stimuli in this particular way. Not always, but sometimes. And I think that can be helpful for understanding yourself in social settings, in more intimate relationships or one-on-one relationships, and in just kind of reacting to like stressors, or the way by which like you decompress, or the way by which you work in group dynamics. So I think there's something to be said. There's something to be helpful, but it's not, at the end of the day, sort of the defining reality of what like humanity is. So if we find some sort of balance between those two, some kind of virtuous mean, I think there's enough. We can talk about it in ways that could be useful, but not ways that we are like bound by them, if that makes any coherent sense.
Totes, yeah. That's a good thumbnail sketch for the episode, because I think we can just maybe situate it in terms of, like what helps it affords you. Well, we'll talk about what it is, like what temperaments signify, and then what sort of helps they can afford you, and then how you can incorporate them maybe in your spiritual life. But yeah, I mean, you were mentioning reading the article about the Enneagram. I'm like a third of the way through The Temperament That God Gave You, because it was recommended to me, which is good. It's sweet. It kind of gives a little index at the outset, and then it talks about temperaments in relationships. It's mostly ordered to family life, so it's like among spouses, between parents and children, and things like that. But then it concludes with a section about the spiritual life. So yeah, maybe we can talk a little bit about what the temperaments are. You've probably heard of the ancient medicinal theory that there ought to be a balance of the 4 humors, and those would be like blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. That kind of biology which informed the theory doesn't so much obtain given our current understanding of things. But yeah, there's still a bodily component to the 4 temperaments, and Father Jacob Bertrand, you alluded to a couple of them, but there's choleric, melancholic, sanguine, and phlegmatic. And again, the way that we use these words is a decent indicator of what they are. But yeah, maybe if you want to just kind of give us a thumbnail sketch of what we use as associations, and maybe some of the character strengths that you've picked up in your interactions with people of such like sorts.
Yeah. As Father Gregory was mentioning, these, like the humors were thought to be like basically before. I guess I have no clue the time kind of scale on these things, but before the advent of modern medicine, they were understood. The humors, the 4 humors that Father Gregory mentioned: sanguine, which referred was with reference to the blood; phlegmatic, to like phlegm, kind of, a really pretty picture; choleric, this idea of choleric, yellow bile; and melancholic, black bile. That these 4 humors, these 4 sort of things, need to be balanced in the body. And sometimes when there was an imbalance, there would have to be either like a letting of blood, by way of example. This is probably what people are most familiar with, bloodletting, so as to balance the sort of like the things within the body to give a person better health. But I think with respect to the way we're talking about them in the temperaments and kind of a psychological kind of thing, personality, dispositions, the 4 temperaments are, let's just define, walk through them real quick. So sanguine is somebody who is sort of, I don't know, like optimistic, lively, kind of carefree. They're typically I don't know, not laid back in the sense of like melancholic, but like easygoing, easy personalities to get along with. So that's, I guess, a sanguine. A phlegmatic is somebody who is, I would say correct me if I'm wrong, but kind of not me. But super laid back, kind of go with the flow. I don't know. What else would you say about a phlegmatic besides that?
Like peacemaker, typically conflict averse, or they try to quell conflict. And sometimes they're like prone to interiorize if they see that a conflict can be avoided in that way. So yeah, they're pretty like, I think, introverted by comparison to the sanguine, who would be more extroverted.
Yeah. So we have sanguine, phlegmatic, and the choleric. The nice way to describe a choleric is that they're like goal oriented, or they are like analytical or logical, like very practical and straightforward, usually a little more aggressive personality wise, not conflict averse. So Father Gregory's laughing because I'm sort of describing myself. So I have an easier time describing the choleric. So fine. And then the fourth tier after the sanguine, phlegmatic, choleric is the melancholic. The melancholic, in sort of a bad way of describing a melancholic, is someone who is given to melancholy, someone who's a little more kind of, I don't know, pessimistic, kind of, what I'm trying to think of like nice ways. I'm thinking of people that are melancholic that I can kind of like poke fun at, but they're a little more, introverted, kind of pessimistic, given to like being alone, those sort of things, I think. I don't know. You could probably describe it with...
whereas the choleric might be more extroverted, the melancholic would be more introverted. I think a melancholic who was trying to describe himself in a way that was flattering would say that he's idealistic, so motivated by things like truth and justice, of a more kind of ponderous or contemplative sort. So yeah, they might react slowly to stimuli, but then they'll form an opinion and they'll hold to that opinion. So unfortunately, they can be very fierce in the judgments that they make, even if those are like judgments of unforgiveness, for instance. So as Father Jacob Bertrand is to choleric, so am I to melancholic. Woo! Yeah. Oh gosh. Okay. So that'd be like the basic lay of the land. You've got a couple of more extroverted types, a couple of more introverted types, and then you see these different reactions to stimuli. So just as Father Jacob Bertrand mentioned at the top of the episode, a lot of what it is a description of how one reacts to stimuli, how intensely, and then how long, as it were, like what the duration of that reaction would be. So it's a good way by which to understand, how you process or how you interact with the exterior world, and then maybe how you can talk yourself down or kind of like get yourself more motivated, as it were, or give impetus as a way of maybe supplementing for or ameliorating some of the deficiencies and excesses. So I think that, just kind of given that basic landscape now, we have a decent setting in which to ask maybe some more, I don't know, like maybe some questions along the lines of, okay, so given that this is the case, and maybe I'm able to identify myself in one of these descriptions, well, what does it matter? Is it something that I can change? Like, it sounds like the type of thing it's just part of how you were born. It's part of nature. Maybe there's a little bit of nurture there, but to what extent do I have control over it? And if I do, is it good? Does that represent like a kind of suppression, or does that represent a kind of repression? So when we come back after the break, we'll get into these questions, how much stock we should put in the temperaments, and then maybe how much ought we were to reduce our life to temperaments. So stick with us and we'll treat it in turn.
You are listening to Godsplaining. Visit us at godsplaining.org to listen to our episodes, shop our store, and donate to our podcast. All gifts go to improving the podcast and bringing the gospel to more listeners. Thanks for your support.
All right, and we're back here on this episode of Godsplaining, in which we are talking about the 4 temperaments, not as a way by which to reduce ourselves or to put ourselves in a kind of pop psychological box, but as a way by which to better understand what animates us, and how best to live a life ordered to, health, sanctity, happiness of a certain sort. So, Father Jacob Bertrand, we're going to ask the question, like, how much stock should we put in this temperament talk? Like, what good does it get us, or what application do you see it having? So get us going.
Yeah, I think that falls under the realm of self-knowledge, and especially when we're talking about like the spiritual life, of like, knowing yourself. I guess that's a tautology for self-knowledge, because I'm just reversing words around to define it. So, and there's a great, I'm sure I've said it on the podcast in some episode before, but there's this, and like looking back in the tradition of the Christian spiritual life, there's, especially towards the Desert Fathers and kind of like the really ancient and kind of foundational movement that has inspired and formed the traditions of the Christian spiritual life. There's this kind of triptych that was used, and basically it's a triptych moving from self-knowledge to self-acceptance to self-transcendence. So just like super quick word on each, but really we'll focus on the self-knowledge thing. That this idea of growing in the spiritual life has to begin with knowing yourself, not in a sort of like existential, like, know thyself so as to like whatever, but to know yourself so as to recognize like who you are. Like it has to do with humility, to recognize who you are before God, that you are a sinner in need of God's grace, but also that you are invited to share in God's divine life. That moves then to self-acceptance, that knowing who you are, you kind of accept that, like, yes, I'm a sinner and I'm in need of God's grace. So you move through that. And then the self-transcendence isn't a sort of Gnostic move outside of the body or something like that, but a sort of like detachment from the fact that I'm a sinner. That like the focus is not that I'm a sinner, but the focus is that God is God. So this sort of move there. And I think talking about the temperaments really falls into that self-knowledge category. Being an expert in the temperaments, or being an expert in the temperament that you fall into, is not the sort of Gnostic key to further growth in the spiritual life, but it is helpful to growth in the spiritual life and in virtue and those sort of things. So to know, as we were talking about before the break, how you react to external stimuli or stressors or that sort of thing, that like me as a choleric, I'm going to react very quickly, but like I'll probably get annoyed very quickly, but I'll be over it in like 4 seconds and then be annoyed about something else. That's just like, I know that's how I work, so I don't put too much stock in it. Or like Father Gregory, he just will brood over things for years and years and years and years and years. I'm just kidding. But, as like a melancholic, he's going to react differently to it. So it's really, I think, a matter of self-knowledge, but recognizing that self-knowledge is not the epitome, is not the height of Christian perfection, but really just kind of the starting point, and is a tool to help, know ourselves a little bit better. I guess one other thought here is that, when sometimes, in hearing confessions, people will confess that I was angry, confess anger. And so then my question is always like, at what? Why were you angry? Because sometimes, we ought to be angry. Sometimes a situation demands that we're angry, and anger can become a sin when it broods, when we dwell on it, and those sort of things. But it's a knowing of, like, okay, this is the situation. This is why I reacted to it in this way. But not allowing anger to become a stumbling block. It's like, it's a reaction. That's how I react to something that causes me to be angry when I see an injustice. So too with the temperaments. They're not stumbling blocks, and they're also not the height of Christian life, but helpful to know that, like, this is how I react in a particular situation or a particular setting. So I think that's where we ought to give them credence and room in our lives, spiritual and more broadly speaking.
Yeah, I think here of something that St. Thomas describes when he talks about the emotions. He says, taken at face value, they're neither good nor bad. They just kind of are, right? It's something that we share in common with animals, but where it becomes morally significant is how we shape them, how we form them, basically how we kind of submit them to the reign of virtue. And I think you can say a similar thing with respect to the temperaments. There are certain aspects of our lives which are kind of morally neutral at face value, and then the question is, how do we incorporate them in our more kind of broadly or richly human life? And with respect to temperament, you can kind of like look at a temperament, and it affords you a way of making sense of the way that you or someone else responds to certain situations. And then you can say, okay, This seems to be how the chips fall, but then how do I play my hand, right? So we've bet as we have, but what about the cards in front of me? What about the subsequent game? And I think that's where we make it a point of drawing out strengths, right? And seeking to heal and to elevate weaknesses so that our temperaments becomes a kind of base of operation, not an excuse for being lazy, for being selfish, for being impetuous, for being, superficial, but that it becomes a source of, recognition, like you said, of self-knowledge, so that we can accept, right, like you said, further who we are, and then not like get beyond ourselves, but like get beyond the limitations which might keep us from realizing our full potential as human beings. Not in like a be all that you can be kind of pop psychology way, but so as to be better cooperators with the reign of grace in our life. Because, we're free. We're real agents, albeit secondary agents with respect to God, who is the primary agent, but real agents. And I think that knowing something about your temperament and the temperaments of others can help you in your spiritual life, but also in your relationship, so that you can draw out what's best from yourself and then draw out what is best from family and from friends. Okay, so that being said, whenever we talk about temperaments, I think, though, there is a temptation to reduce it all to temperament, or to put people in a temperament box, as it were, like we talk about, what would you call that? Prejudicial treatment of one sort or the other, like racism or sexism. There can be a sort of, I'm going to make up a word, temperamentalism. No, never mind. Temperamentism, where you say like, oh, you're just doing that because, or, oh, that's exactly what you would say because you're, it's just like, okay, maybe, but also maybe not. So what do we do to resist this tendency just to explain everything in terms of the least common denominator? Where do we go from here?
Yeah, the reality is that the temperaments are not virtues. It's not like there's the four cardinal virtues of prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance, and then sanguine, or like the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love, and choleric. These aren't virtues. They are, as Father Gregory was saying when he was talking about the emotions, in and of themselves, sort of neutral realities or kind of descriptors of behavior rather than definers of behavior. And in that means that they don't lend themselves in and of themselves to goodness, to virtue. You can have a saintly melancholic, and you can have a saintly choleric, or a saintly phlegmatic, or even a saintly sanguine. Like any of these things are possible. But in the end, we're not, we can't allow like how we pursue virtue and goodness and how we pursue the Lord to be sort of determined by a sort of disposition to act, or by kind of like a way of our kind of, I guess, addressing sort of interpersonal relationships. Because in the end, we're called to live a virtuous life, and we're called to do the good and pursue the good, and move away from what is evil and vicious in our life. So that's the case for all, whatever temperament and whatever like secondary temperament you might fall into. And it's important to recognize that just because you're, well, I won't call anybody out. Just because I'm a choleric doesn't mean I get to be a jerk to people all the time. That's, or just because somebody is a phlegmatic doesn't mean they get to like get away without ever having to make like a commitment or a decision in their life. Like they aren't excuses for less than like ideal behavior. They are just ways by which to help understand like, oh, why do I always kind of get annoyed very quickly? It's like, well, this is just kind of, it's part of who I am. So rather than being excuses, in some ways they're kind of helpful in saying, at least like me, again, a choleric, well, in a particular situation, in most situations, I might be given to like quick emotions, but like in knowing that, well, perhaps I can preempt that or react better, knowing that, like, and not be caught off guard by a quick emotive response, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Another thing that I like, or I find helpful kind of as a fruit of this type of meditation, is like the way in which we can perfect our relationships, or the way in which we can perfect our friendships. Because when you think about it, like, what's the goal of the spiritual life but love, to love God with his own love and to love our neighbor with the same. And certainly in the context of family and friends and colleagues and things like that, we have many opportunities to grow in love But sometimes we get tripped up, like we get tripped up in love before we ever really get going. So like say, you're phlegmatic and you're conflict averse. You might try to convince yourself that everyone is basically fine, right? And that you don't have any enemies and no one is doing anything contrary to your good, because you don't want to confront the notion that there might actually be a kind of injustice that needs to be redressed. Or this situation is not just going to go away, and as a result of which it requires some type of action on your part. Okay, well, now, like maybe you've had that kind of brought to your attention, and you have just kind of like greater impetus then to go about doing it charitably rather than just kind of retreating within the limitations of your personality or of your temperament. So to really love somebody means to will their good, and sometimes willing their good will mean conflict, right? Will mean confronting them on something that makes their life or his or her life and your life worse and keeps you from loving God to the utmost. Or like, for a melancholic, you're conscious of the fact that you are slow to form judgments, but when you do, they can be very harsh, idealistic. Some would describe them as judgmental or exacting. Okay, great. So then what are you going to do to kind of introduce a principle of mercy into your life? Well, there's no like cheating nature, as it were. It's just the only thing that can go about ameliorating it is grace. But conscious of your own limitations, perhaps there's a greater openness there to being merciful, right? To being meek, to being clement, to softening some of the harshness or severity of your judgments so that you can be of, like greater service or greater help to those with whom you find yourself kind of working shoulder to shoulder. And something that actually doesn't get that much play, which I think is super helpful, is there can be a big emphasis, or there stands to be a big emphasis on affirmation. Like for instance, if you want to motivate a choleric, you challenge them. But a lot of people don't respond well to challenge. They just kind of get overwhelmed by it. They feel inadequate to it. So what's the response? Well, oftentimes, like the pop psychologist will encourage a kind of affirmation of a sort, which is great. It might feel kind of disingenuous at the outset if you're like complimenting somebody just to motivate them, maybe even a little bit manipulative. But truth be told, like you got to fake it till you make it. And if we're going to grow in charity, I think part of that will be telling people that we love them, or that there are things about those people that are lovable, even if maybe we're not especially predisposed to activity of that sort, whether because of, your temperament or the culture from which you come or this, that, or the other thing. So I think that, the knowledge that we gain from something like this helps us to be more conscious of or more open to the type of grace which can really propel us in our spiritual lives so as to be more faithful, hopeful, and loving. You have further thoughts along those lines?
Just that when we were going through, back when we were a lot younger, in our younger days, when we were going through formation, when we were learning, when we were taking our theoretical and then practical courses in hearing confessions and how to do that, one of the things that is stressed here, here for me, I'm at the House of Studies, but here at the House of Studies is to not, even in our preaching too, but I'm thinking of hearing confessions, is not to dive or delve into a sort of moralistic teaching of the faith whereby we're just sort of like issuing commands, but like don't do this and do that, but really to rely on virtue and growth in virtue and in friendship with Christ, and that growth in virtue leads to friendship with Christ. So in hearing confessions, when someone, if you're going to offer some sort of counsel, well, you don't have to say, well, read, I'm very prideful. Well, read about the virtue of humility, but encourage people to pray for humility, these contrary virtues to the vices. And I think that's the same thing here with the temperament, and knowing yourself a little bit in these ways of how you react, how you interact. We can pray for those, as Father Gregory was describing. We can pray for those virtues to be sort of holier, to react better. So like a choleric might need to pray for a bit more patience than somebody else, or a melancholic might need to pray for a bit more like command, or maybe a phlegmatic, a bit more command and exercising and action when he moves through like making a prudent decision. So this idea harkens again back to the idea that we're not boxed in by the temperaments. We shouldn't give excuse to our behavior because, oh, he's just a choleric, so that's how he acts to be. Well, maybe he's just a jerk too, and needs to stop being a jerk, and needs to, so there might be some virtue to pursue there. So I think it's also helpful, not just as a descriptor, of how we act or how we might be given to act. But as Father Gregory was saying, as a way by which to like dive more deeply into our pursuit of virtue and to play a little offense in growth, in our growth in virtue, in our pursuit of holiness, in that if we know we might be given to behave in a particular way in this or that setting, well, we can continue to pray for the virtues that, in group settings, and maybe, to be more charitable, be more patient, to be more whatever, before we find ourselves in a difficult spot or a temptation or that sort of thing.
Yeah. I think that's probably a good thought with which to conclude. Ultimately, the temperaments are the setting for our freedom, right? They don't determine us to live in one way or the other, nor are they made to be an excuse whereby we give ourselves to permission to be less than God wills us to be, because all the Christian faithful of whatever rank or status are called to the perfection of charity, and that's possible to us, regardless of how we're made, because God's gifts are sufficient, more than sufficient. They're abundant. So with that, thanks so much for listening to this episode. Please do like it. Please do review it or comment upon it. Please do share it, and then subscribe on your podcast app or subscribe on YouTube if you haven't yet. We're grateful for that. And if you do subscribe on YouTube, push that little bell, because then Google will be forced to tell you when a video of this sort comes out again. A special thanks to our Patreon supporters who enable and promote the work of the podcast, for which we are grateful, and please God, we hope that many are blessed by it. Stay tuned for Livesplaining and Guestsplaining. We're going to take a little hiatus, a little break during the month of December, since we will be bombarding you with Lectio Divina episodes on the weekends. So you'll see those come back in force in January, but a little bit of a lessening there in December. And then, that's what remains. So our prayers are for you. Please pray for us, and we will catch you next time on Godsplaining.
Thanks for listening to Godsplaining, a work of the Dominican friars of the province of St. Joseph. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Leave a review on your podcast app, and visit us at godsplaining.org.